Hey, what's up, fight freaks, and welcome back. I'm the Combat Remix, bringing the MMA Fix to diehard fans. And not for those who think that a flying triangle is something like this. Yeah, I don't even know what the hell that is. Today we're going over every time a reigning UFC champion was an underdog in a title fight. So let's get to it. Come on, damn it, cue the music. Before we kick off this list, let me be very clear about a few factors. These bouts can include champion versus champion, interim champ versus non-champion. Bouts that were canceled and never took place will be considered. In fact, we don't even need to have a signed contract, because we know damn well that betting odds can be put out long before a fight is ever officially made. It's also important to note that we are not expecting complete unanimous agreement on these betting odds. I'm sure we all remember multiple times where different sportsbook establishments did not agree on who was the favorite and who was the underdog in the same MMA fight. But regardless of the sportsbook establishment, at any time, no matter how brief, there is even one single betting line that has the champion as the underdog, they will be on this list. And while I'm only including the ones that I've 100% verified, there are a few I'm still curious about, but unfortunately the public information regarding the betting lines is limited to non-existent. Okay, that's enough explanation. Let's get to that list in chronological order. First bout is our third fight between Vitor Belfort and Randy Couture at UFC 49. And this will certainly make sense to those who remember their previous fight at UFC 46. Only lasted 49 seconds. Vitor landed a glancing blow that unfortunately tore open a huge cut under Randy's eye. He's rendered unable to continue, so technically Vitor becomes the new champion. They rematch at UFC 49, and Randy just absolutely dominates him. Official betting odds for this fight had Couture anywhere between a minus 165 to a minus 185 favorite, while Belfort was a plus 135 to a plus 160 underdog. Our next title fight brings us to the third fight between then-champion Tim Sylvia and Andrei Arlovski at UFC 61. Just as it seemed that Arlovski was going to get another first-round win over Tim Sylvia caught Arlovski coming into the attack and dropped him. Add in a little bit of ground and pound, and you have a TKO victory for Tim Sylvia. Many people consider this a fluke win for Sylvia, so it was no surprise when Arlovski, being the challenger, came into the rematch at UFC 61 as high as a minus 285 favorite, seeing then-champion Sylvia as a 225 underdog. But to many people's surprise, it was actually Tim Sylvia to win the trilogy bout by unanimous decision. Our next title fight brings us to UFC 74, where we see reigning champion Randy Couture take on Gabriel Gonzaga. Now, although Couture went on to dominate this fight, he even said it himself that because of his age and the size of the heavyweight division, he wouldn't be surprised if he was going to be the underdog the rest of his career. But nonetheless, the official betting odds were minus 135 in favor of Gonzaga, while the reigning champion Couture was about a plus 115. Our next bout brings us to UFC 75, where we see a unification title bout in the UFC light heavyweight division. It was at this time that Zuffa bought out Pride, so now you have the Pride champion Dan Henderson taking on the UFC champion Quentin Rampage Jackson. This bout goes overlooked for numerous reasons. You have the Zuffa Pride deal, it's a unification title bout, and in most cases, Rampage Jackson was actually the favorite. However, several betting lines were in Henderson's favor. The largest margin discrepancy I could verify had Henderson as a minus 120 favorite, while champion Rampage Jackson was a plus 100 underdog. Our next title fight brings us to UFC 83, which sees reigning champion Matt Serra rematch the challenger Georges St-Pierre. This one's pretty straightforward, as a very high majority of people thought Georges St-Pierre was going to win the belt back. In fact, out of all the betting lines on this list, this is the second highest discrepancy, where Georges St-Pierre was a minus 460 favorite, while champion Serra was a plus 400 underdog. Our next bout takes us to UFC 91, where we have Randy Couture still champion, but now he faces Brock Lesnar. Despite being much older and massively undersized, the betting odds were relatively close, considering that the highest betting odds in challenger Lesnar's favor I could find was about a minus 140, while Randy was about a plus 110. And while Randy put up a hell of a fight, he eventually was finished and Lesnar would become the new UFC heavyweight champion. Next title fight on the list brings us to UFC 98, which saw reigning champion Rashad Evans take on Lyoto Machida. Machida was on an absolute tear coming up to this title fight, while many people were very critical of Rashad Evans, saying that he was only undefeated because of many undeserved split decision wins, and perhaps several comeback wins as well, such as in his bouts against Sean Selman, Chuck Liddell, and Forrest Griffin. While the criticisms against Rashad Evans were in many cases undeserved and perhaps even exaggerated, that didn't stop Machida from absolutely dominating this fight. Official betting odds had Machida as high as a -220 favorite, while champion Evans was a +170 underdog. Next fight on the list brings us to UFC 118 and the immediate rematch between newly crowned champion Frankie Edgar and BJ Penn. After their first fight at UFC 112, many called for an immediate rematch due to a controversial decision. Now, while I don't agree that the decision was controversial, in fact, I thought Frankie Edgar clearly won the fight, I can certainly see why they wanted to do a rematch. In fact, I thought BJ Penn was going to win the rematch, and I couldn't have been more wrong. Just like so many others, I thought this would motivate BJ to do a much better performance. In fact, the betting odds had him as high as a -270 favorite, while champion Edgar was a +240 underdog. But the betting odds didn't reflect the outcome of this fight whatsoever, as Edgar would dominate Penn for all 5 rounds, taking unanimous decision, thus solidifying his validity as the lightweight champion. Though I may have spoken too soon, because next on our list we have reigning champion Frankie Edgar and his next title defense against challenger Gray Maynard. For me personally, it was a bit odd to see Edgar as the underdog, considering he had 2 consecutive wins over BJ Penn, the fighter who many consider to be the greatest lightweight of all time. But nonetheless, this is one of the most entertaining title bouts that happened up until this point in time. In fact, the betting odds weren't as bad as you might think, with challenger Gray Edgar, yeah, of course, that's a real person. Challenger Gray Maynard was a -150 favorite, while Frankie Edgar was a +130 underdog. And as a small side note, you will not see the third fight on this list. I was a bit surprised to see that, but all betting odds had Frankie Edgar as the unanimous favorite going into the third fight. Next title fight on the list, I'm sure, is one everybody saw coming. At UFC 128, it is Jon Jones challenging champion Mauricio Shogun Rua for the light heavyweight strap. In addition to the betting odds, a vast majority of the live polls they were taking were picking Jon Jones to beat Shogun, which is exactly what he did in devastating fashion. The official betting odds for this fight were Jon Jones at a -200, where Shogun was a +175. After UFC 128, we don't have another entry on this list until UFC 164, which is the rematch of reigning champion Benson Henderson against Anthony Pettis. Everything was pretty much right down the line. The predictions, the betting odds. In fact, the odds were so close that in most cases, both fighters had minus betting odds. But it just so happens that Pettis took a slight majority in the fact that it was something along the lines of a -115 favorite, where Benson Henderson would be something along the lines of a -105. Now, as razor close as that is, Pettis still put a definitive win on this fight, making him the new UFC lightweight champion. Next fight on our list brings us to UFC 168, where we see the rematch between now champion Chris Weidman and Anderson Silva. Many people thought Chris Weidman's knockout over the Spider was a fluke due to Anderson Silva's, I'll be nice and call it playful nature. There was much talk about how Anderson Silva coming into this rematch as the challenger would give him the motivation to show us that old Spider. But unfortunately, the rematch ended in a much more odd fashion than the first. Silva would unfortunately break his leg on a check kick, and he wasn't unable to continue. Official betting odds had Silva as a -175 favorite, while champion Chris Weidman was a +165 underdog. Our next fight is yet another rematch between reigning champion Robbie Lawler and Rory McDonald. Neither was champion in their first bout, yet it was an extremely close fight that saw Lawler get the split decision nod. Both fighters would go on a tear after that fight, so when they met again in the rematch, it was for championship status. And the two certainly didn't disappoint. In fact, to this day, that fight is considered one of the greatest title fights in UFC history. Toward the end of the 5th round, after a completely bloody battle, Lawler landed some critical blows that visibly hurt McDonald. And unfortunately, he just couldn't take any more, and he weathered under the pressure. Official betting odds saw Robbie Lawler as a +145 underdog, while Rory McDonald was a -175 favorite. Next title fight brings us to UFC 194, where we see champion Jose Aldo take on challenger Conor McGregor. Now, you may have not been expecting this one because, as far as I can tell, all the betting odds had Jose Aldo as the favorite the night of the fight. However, it was rather public that the betting odds opened with Conor McGregor as a 2-1 favorite. In fact, he was a pretty unanimous favorite all the way up until the day prior to the fight. and in many cases, still a favorite the morning of the fight. Now, as we were nearing the fight, regardless of who was considered the favorite, the odds were still very close, but the most reliable numbers I have as Conor being the favorite are minus 135 in his favor, while champion Jose Aldo was a plus 105. Next fight brings us to UFC 195, where we see still champion Robbie Lawler take on the challenger Carlos Condit. This fight may take the cake for the closest betting odds across the board, where there was a lot of shifting, but it was going back and forth with both of these fighters in the negative odds. One specific one stands out because it was minus 113 to minus 107, and that particular one would stay stagnant even the night of the fight in Condit's favor, where many of the other odds that originally had Condit as a slight favorite would revert back to the minus 115, minus 105 in favor of Lawler. Regardless of who you think should have won, this was an excellent fight. It was one of the best in UFC history. But I will say hashtag robbery. But officially, Lawler retains his belt, and you can make an argument that neither one of these fighters were the same after this fight. The next two fights on our list actually come from the same UFC 205 event. First, our co-main event of champion Tyrone Woodley taking on Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Then our champion versus champion main event, which has featherweight champion Conor McGregor stepping up in weight, challenging Eddie Alvarez for his lightweight strap. The co-main event bout actually won fight of the night at the event. And while there was some controversy about the decision, it ultimately ended in a draw. Considering the top opponents that Wonderboy was piecing up, including Rory McDonald, it's no surprise that he came into this fight as a minus 185 favorite, while champion Woodley came in as a plus 160 underdog. As for the main event, remember, this is a lightweight bout, and even though Conor McGregor was the champion at the lighter weight class, he still came into this fight as a minus 160 favorite, while champion Eddie Alvarez came in as a plus 140 underdog. McGregor really shined in his boxing in this fight and put an absolute striking clinic on Eddie Alvarez, and not only did this make him the new lightweight champ, but he became the first fighter to simultaneously hold two belts in two different weight classes. Next we have the most ambiguous and unorthodox spot on this list. It's Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. And no, I'm not talking about UFC 229 because Khabib was both the favorite and the champ in that fight. I'm referring to a very specific point in time where right after Conor McGregor became the lightweight champion, official betting odds did come out for the two fighters considered the most likely to face McGregor in his first title defense. Not surprisingly, those two fighters were Tony Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov. And while the betting lines had champion McGregor as a minus 175 favorite in his bout against Tony Ferguson, he did not have that luxury against Khabib, who was roughly a minus 130 favorite, while champion McGregor was about a plus 120 underdog. Next title fight brings us to UFC 207, where we see new champion Amanda Nunes taking on former champion Ronda Rousey. Now this fight really makes you feel bad for Rousey. Not only did she lose her belt in a pretty demoralizing defeat, go on a long hiatus, but then she had to come back and fight a monster like Amanda Nunes only to get knocked out in 48 seconds. Well, hey, I don't make the betting odds, so it is what it is. Official betting odds had Rousey as a minus 175 favorite, while champion Nunes was a plus 150 underdog. Our next title fight takes place at UFC 209, which is a rematch of champion Tyrone Woodley taking on challenger Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Now, if you remember correctly, their first fight at UFC 205 was a draw. But nonetheless, for the second consecutive time, Wonderboy Thompson was still the betting favorite. In fact, the odds in his favor actually increased from the previous fight, jumping up from a minus 185 from their first fight up to a minus 240 in the second. However, instead of a plus 160 underdog, Tyrone Woodley would go down to a plus 120. Things to mention about this fight is, one, it wasn't nearly as exciting as their first bout. In fact, it was pretty bad in comparison. And also, I really don't know how Wonderboy wasn't given the decision. It was really bad judging in my opinion. Next fight on the list is a rematch between now champion Daniel Cormier and challenger Anthony Rumble Johnson. Couple fun facts surrounding this fight. Cormier was also the underdog in their first title bout. But you won't see that fight on this list because, as many of you may remember, that was for the vacant title, so there was no defending champion. Both of these title bouts were quite similar in the sense that each fight would show early success for Rumble Johnson, but slowly Cormier would take over and end the fight with a rear naked choke. Official betting odds would see Rumble Johnson as a minus 140 favorite, while champion Daniel Cormier was a plus 120 underdog. Our next title fight brings us to UFC 214, which is the rematch between Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier. The rematch would see a bit of a change-up as Daniel Cormier was now the light heavyweight champion due to Jon Jones being Jon Jones. Considering that Jones never lost his belt in the octagon and was technically the challenger, it makes perfect sense that this fight would be on this list because he was a pretty sizable favorite. In fact, Jones was about a minus 270 favorite, while champion Cormier was about a plus 210 underdog. Next fight on this list brings us to UFC 215 and the rematch between champion Amanda Nunes versus Valentina Shevchenko. Finding several betting lines that had Shevchenko as a slight favorite would be completely understandable, but I was completely shocked to find out that Amanda Nunes was the underdog in nearly every betting line I could find. It's almost as if people forgot that Nunes clearly won their first fight and practically dominated every fight since, including winning the title. Although Amanda Nunes would win the rematch and defend her title, official betting odds had Shevchenko as a minus 145 favorite, while champion Amanda Nunes was anywhere from a minus 110 to a plus 125 underdog. Next on our list is a fight that never came into fruition. It's champion Michael Bisping versus Yoel Romero. After defeating Dan Henderson in his first title defense, Michael Bisping was looking at several fighters for his next possible fight. Official betting odds came out for the fighter that seemed the most plausible in Yoel Romero, and the fight seemed practically inevitable considering they recently had some bad blood towards one another. Romero would be a massive minus 300 favorite, while champion Bisping was a plus 230 underdog. Not much later, reports had come out that Michael Bisping was negotiating a possible fight with Jacare Souza, and while many have speculated that Souza would also be a sizable favorite over the champ, I was unable to confirm any official betting odds to substantiate that claim. But have no fear, because in our next title fight, we have the winner of the Michael Bisping lottery. At UFC 217, we have Georges St. Pierre returning from a several-year hiatus and moving up in weight to challenge Michael Bisping for his middleweight belt. Come on, that's just f***ed up. When the betting lines first came out, it seemed like it was pretty split down the middle, but more and more were leaning towards GSP until it was pretty much unanimous. GSP was consistently shown as a minus 120 to a minus 140 favorite, while champion Bisping was about a plus 110 underdog. Not only did GSP's victory over Bisping put him on a short list of people who have won championships in 2 different weight classes, but it resurrected conversations of him being possibly the greatest fighter of all time. Next title fight, we have Stipe Miocic versus Francis Ngannou. This entry didn't surprise anybody. You have a fighter larger than life, shredded to the bone, who's finished all of his victories, most of them by knockout, and a lot of those were very dangerous strikers. So practically no one was shocked when Francis Ngannou came out as a minus 170 favorite over champion Stipe, who was a plus 130 underdog. Next title fight brings us to UFC 223. It's an immediate rematch between newly crowned champion Rose Namajunas and Joanna Jędrzejczyk. In a sense, I find this fight to be a lot like GSP versus Matt Serra. Seeing a heavily favored champion get knocked out in the first round, only to come back in the rematch to be the favorite because so many people thought the first loss was a fluke. Although the fight would go the distance in a bout that was much more closely contested, Namajunas would retain her title in a second consecutive victory over Jędrzejczyk. Official betting odds would see Jędrzejczyk as a minus 120 to a minus 125 favorite, while champion Namajunas was anywhere between a plus 180 to a minus 110 underdog. Next fight brings us to UFC 225, which is the rematch between champion Robert Whittaker and Yoel Romero. This technically wasn't a title bout, although it was scheduled to be, but I'm not going down that rabbit hole, so I'm going to let you guys decide who's to blame for that. This fight was razor close. In fact, many people say it should have been a draw, which I wouldn't have a problem with because the same man would have left with the belt anyway. Considering that Whittaker was the defending champion and already had a win over Romero, it made sense that he was nearly the favorite in every single betting line. However, I was able to find one official betting line that did have Romero as a minus 120 favorite, while champion Whittaker was a minus 110 underdog. Both fighters minus odds. That's incredibly close. The next 2 entries on our list bring us to UFC 228. First up is the cancelled co-main event between champion Nico Montano versus Valentina Shevchenko. This was set to be Montano's first title defense after winning her title in the TUF 26 finale. However, before the official weigh-ins, it was reported that Montano was taken to the hospital due to complications from weight cutting. Official betting odds for this fight had Shevchenko as a minus 600 favorite, while champion Montano was a plus 450, making this the largest gap discrepancy on any betting line on this list. However, our main event at UFC 228 did in fact take place, and that was between champion Tyrone Woodley and challenger Darren Till. Now, Till was a huge up-and-comer, getting a real big push by the UFC, so it was no surprise, at least not to me. Odds were about a minus 120 favorite for Till, while champion Woodley was about a plus 100 underdog. And we all know that there were some possible weight issues going into this fight for Till, but nonetheless, he got absolutely demolished in that fight by Woodley, making quick work of him, knocking him down, controlling him on the ground, and submitting him. Now, the next fight on our list brings us to UFC 231, and this might be a surprise to most people because we have champion Max Holloway taking on challenger Brian Ortega. Now, while this may be attributed to much of the success Brian Ortega had, even knocking out Frankie Edgar leading up to that fight, but also Max Holloway pulled out of their first scheduled fight
And leading up to that, there was some questions about his health, and it looked like he may have been on the decline. But there were a lot of question marks that Max Holloway had to answer that night. Now, ultimately, we know in hindsight he did and put on a dominant performance, but at least before the fight actually happened, we can see why the betting odds, or at least some of the betting odds, definitely had Max Holloway as an underdog. Now, in the cases where Ortega was considered the favorite, they were still very close odds, where it was a minus 125 in favor of the challenger and a minus 105 for champion Max Holloway. Next fight on our list brings us to UFC Fight Night 143, where we see Henry Cejudo defending his flyweight belt against the then bantamweight champion TJ Dillashaw. Now, while this fight is a technicality because both fighters were champions at the time, we are only taking consideration the flyweight belt because that was the only belt on the line for this fight. Now, this fight only lasted 32 seconds, and many people, including myself, think that the fight may have been stopped prematurely. While the official victory for Cejudo skyrocketed his popularity, we should remember that before this fight took place, people were questioning his validity as the flyweight champion. Many prominent voices in MMA were quite outspoken on the fact that they thought Demetrius Johnson should have been awarded the victory over Cejudo. Then you got to factor in Dillashaw's ability to wrestle, superior striking and footwork, and the fact that he's faced bigger opponents with more knockout power, and it's not really a surprise that he came in as a minus 210 favorite, while champion Cejudo came in as a plus 170 underdog. Next fight on the list brings us to UFC 237, where we see champion Rose Namajunas taking on challenger Jessica Andrade. Namajunas did a really good job utilizing her reach and her jiu-jitsu in attempts to stifle any slam attempts from Andrade. However, unfortunately, she eventually succumbed to one of those powerful slams and was knocked out cold. Prior to this title bout, Andrade demonstrated so much raw power in her previous fights that not too many people were surprised when she came in as a minus 120 favorite over champion Namajunas, who came in as a plus 100 underdog. Next fight on our list brings us to UFC 243, where we see champion Robert Whittaker taking on interim champion Israel Adesanya. A bout that shows two excellent strikers, however, one being a little more polished considering Israel Adesanya, before he even entered MMA, was one of the world's greatest strikers. A few other factors at play were Whittaker's inactivity, while Adesanya was remaining very active, defeating Kelvin Gastelum for the interim belt, a fight that actually Whittaker had to pull out of. And many would speculate, would Robert Whittaker return the same after taking so much damage in his rematch against Yoel Romero? And while Adesanya would ultimately go on to defeat Robert Whittaker by second round knockout, the betting odds were quite close, having Israel Adesanya as a minus 130 favorite, while champion Whittaker was a plus 110 underdog. Next fight on our list is Justin Gaethje versus Conor McGregor. Many of you will remember that when Justin Gaethje defeated Tony Ferguson to capture the lightweight interim belt, travel restrictions and the unfortunate passing of Khabib Nurmagomedov's father would put a title unification bout on hold. Shortly after, there was talk of a potential fight between Conor McGregor and Justin Gaethje, and while that fight never took place, several betting lines did come out on that fight. McGregor would come in anywhere between a minus 125 to a minus 140 favorite, while interim champion Gaethje would come in anywhere between a minus 105 to a plus 110 underdog. Next fight on our list brings us to UFC 252, where we see the rubber match between champion Stipe Miocic and challenger Daniel Cormier. Their first fight saw DC defeating Miocic by first round knockout, only to see Miocic regain his title in the rematch by fourth round TKO. In many ways, the third fight wasn't merely for the belt, but for the title of perhaps the greatest heavyweight fighter of all time. Interestingly enough, this was the only fight in the trilogy where the heavyweight champion going into the fight was not considered the majority favorite. Their first fight at UFC 226 saw heavyweight champ Miocic as a unanimous favorite, with the betting odds being anywhere between a minus 160 to a minus 225, while light heavyweight champion Cormier was anywhere between a plus 140 to a plus 175 underdog.
Hey, buddy, down in front!
Going into their rematch at UFC 241, it had newly crowned heavyweight champ Cormier as the unanimous favorite, showing betting odds anywhere between a minus 130 to a minus 160. And Miocic, now coming in as the challenger, would be a plus 105 to a plus 130 underdog. Now, while it's true that their trilogy fights saw the betting odds shifting quite often, and most of the fights were actually dead even odds across the board, the fact is, when the betting odds picked a definitive favorite, it was nearly always in the case of Cormier. And in nearly every case, both fighters had minus betting odds. However, I was only able to verify one official betting odd that had champion Miocic as the favorite, having the champ as a minus 109 favorite, while challenger Cormier was a minus 105 underdog. And while I mentioned earlier that Carlos Condit versus Robbie Lawler perhaps had the closest betting odds on this list, aside from odds being dead even, but not only did this fight have odds that tied it, but it actually surpassed it. One particular betting odd having Cormier as a minus 111 favorite, while champion Miocic was a minus 109 underdog. The next two entries emerged just days after Stipe Miocic defeated Daniel Cormier in their trilogy fight. People are once again touting Stipe Miocic as the greatest heavyweight fighter of all time, which is rather interesting because he's an official underdog in 2 betting lines with 2 potential opponents. The first being a rematch with Francis Ngannou, the second being a heavyweight bout with Jon Jones. While I certainly agree that Francis Ngannou deserves a rematch with the champ, one should take note that as of this time, he's a greater favorite than he was in their original fight, moving from a -170 favorite up to a -190 favorite, while champion Miocic is going from a +130 underdog to a +165. And while the current betting lines for a fight with Jon Jones are closer, Jon Jones still comes in as a -150 favorite, while champion Miocic would be a +130 underdog. The last entry I have on this list is another champion vs. champion fight between Israel Adesanya and Jan Blachowicz. Dana White has come out and confirmed that this fight will be happening. And even though both fighters were extremely impressive in their last fight, the betting odds are pretty damn stacked in Adesanya's favor, especially considering he's the fighter that will be moving up in weight. As of this point in time, Israel Adesanya is anywhere between a -255 to a -278 favorite, while Jan Blachowicz is anywhere between a +210 to a +215 underdog. That is without a doubt the longest MMA list I have ever done, but I'm sure you fight freaks appreciated the research and at the very least found it mildly entertaining. Let me know your opinions in the comments below. Go ahead and tell me any entries you think I may have overlooked that should have been on this list, but don't forget to give me any MMA top 10 lists you'd like me to do or any super fight requests. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. I always appreciate my fight freaks. I'm the Combat Remix, bringing you your MMA fix.
Coming up July 14th, Strike Force, only on Showtime.
Strike Force. Got a nice ring to it.
63 for the television!
He's one gigantic motherfucker.
Welcome, punch!